Albayar, and I'm the Program Coordinator for the Connecting Business Initiative, or CBI, a joint program that was established by the United Nations Development Program and the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you to this webinar, which is organized in partnership with the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction Regional Office for Africa, as well as ARISE Africa, on the topic of strengthening the role of the African private sector in disaster risk management. Today, we are also celebrating the International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction. And with this year's theme shining a light on international cooperation and partnerships for developing countries to reduce their disaster risk and losses, we are extremely excited to have this conversation with all of you and with our panelists today, focusing on how we can support the African private sector in having a clear voice when it comes to disaster risk reduction strategies and activities across the region. This is very much in line with the Connecting Business Initiative's mandate, which is to support the capacity of local private sector networks to prepare for, respond to, and recover from disasters that are caused by natural hazards, extreme weather events, or even complex humanitarian emergencies. All of us at CBI believe that the private sector has a critical role to play in advocating for and implementing strategies to reduce the number of people affected by disaster. We're going to hear a lot more concrete examples and calls to action from our panelists today. But for now, I would just like to take a moment to thank all of you for joining us. And I'd like to introduce Ms. Irina Zodro, the Head of Partnerships and Stakeholder Engagement from the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, who will now give her opening message. Irina, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Karim, and welcome everybody. It's indeed a real pleasure to be here today. So my name is Irina Zodro. I'm the head of the UNDRR Partnerships Unit. And within this, I'm responsible for ARISE globally. So indeed, we just had our ARISE annual meeting last week, and it reflected the great interest and engagement of the private sector to take a lead role in our common quest for a better world. So very nicely aligned with CBI, ARISE focuses on 4 priorities related to disaster risk reduction and prevention, including risk-informed investment, resilient infrastructure, the role of insurance in driving disaster risk reduction, and enhancing the resilience of SMEs. So I think together here with ARISE at the CBI, we really have an excellent starting point to work on enhanced resilience in the Africa region. And in this regard, I really have to say we are delighted to see the engagement from all of you in the region and look forward to working together with you and our government partners and other partners to build resilience and sustainability. And in this regard, it's really high time, as you all know. The world is slowly emerging from the pandemic, but the recovery really depends on where you are. And especially the poorest and most vulnerable countries and people will suffer from the effects of of the pandemic for many years to come. I'm sure you all have seen the recent warnings this week from the IMF and the World Bank about the debt levels, in particular in the poorest and most vulnerable countries. They predict total lost output of 28 trillion and full recovery, economic recovery only by 2025. But honestly, this is not even taking into account what's coming through the climate change emergency and other natural and man-made hazards and disasters. So we can only rise to this challenge if we work together. And challenges remain plenty. I think we can say that there is progress, especially we see progress in the area of climate risk. However, overall, disaster risk is still not integrated at the core of business. I dare say often also not at the core of public decision-making. So markets continue to be risk blind when it comes to high impact shocks. We see this with the stock markets rallying throughout the pandemic. But there's a solution, and we are all at its core, especially you are at its core. We just must integrate disaster risk reduction, the full spectrum of it, into investment decision-making. Or what we say is we must shift from risk blind to risk informed development and investment. And there's something, if anything, positive about the pandemic, because the attention has risen incredibly over the past 2 years to the fact that disaster risk is systemic financial and economic risk and needs to be more integrated in public and private decision making. And there's various progress. in the EU. They're pushing for sustainability and climate risk disclosure. We all see the ESG and net zero discussions everywhere. So let's take this together and work together towards actually implementing disaster risk reduction into policy, into business decisions, into business strategy. We have some great opportunities coming up, with the COP being one of the most closest now, but then also obviously the UNDRR regional and global platforms. So I really look forward to working with all of you. With this, I thank you again. Now pass back to the moderator. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Irina, for your comments. For those of you who are just joining us, another quick note that the session is being recorded for your knowledge. Please do feel free to use the Q&A function in Zoom. If you move your mouse to the bottom of the screen, for most of you, you will find a Q&A box where you can insert any questions you may have or comments during the panel discussion. And other attendees can upvote those questions and comments. We'll make sure to try and get to those during the session. Also, feel free to use the chat function in Zoom to introduce yourselves and where you're calling in from. We're always very interested in knowing that. Without further ado, I'd like to now introduce Michael Sudarkasa. Michael is the CEO of the Africa Business Group and has been working with us for some time. He'll be moderating our panel discussion today. Michael, over to you.
Thank you very much, Kareem, and good morning to everyone who's joined us. This is a particularly exciting session for me as a private sector economic development practitioner who has worked both serving on the ARISE board and also now working closely with colleagues from CBI. And it's exciting because if ever there was a time when we need more private sector engagement on the continent, it is now. We are ravaged by the pandemic, but even prior to the pandemic, the growing population that we have on the continent, we're one of the fastest growing continents in the world, but the challenge is that the capacity of government to keep up from an economic development standpoint, infrastructure development standpoint has not been there. We have increasing influence, as was pointed out earlier, in terms of climate hazards that are ravishing the continent and growing risks. We're starting to have low level and in some countries higher level conflicts, which is displacing people. With the climate, we're having the climate change impact. We're having growing floods, growing droughts. This is impacting agricultural development, and so it's creating food insecurity. And as governments try to keep up, and I just want to give you a picture. I mean, in the next 29 years, the continent of the population of Africa will grow from roughly 1.2 billion to 2.4 billion. So roughly 330 million people per decade. And 60% of that, soon to be 65% of that, will be headed for the urban areas. So it's difficult for governments to keep up with that. And then when you have climate shocks, that's been very difficult for government alone or the humanitarian ecosystem with NGOs and development partners to manage. And so there's a recognition around the world and here on the continent, definitely, that there's a role to play for the private sector. And in the past decade, there have been sporadic interventions by private sector actors. When Ebola hit in West Africa, there was a rallying. In the southern tip, east tip of the continent, when we had tremendous cyclones, there was support. But two institutions, these two, ARISE and Connecting Business initiatives, are trying to see how that process of private sector engagement can be a bit more formal, a bit more efficient, a bit more effective, and a bit more impactful. And so this morning, we're going to have a conversation with colleagues who represent these two organizations and who will share with us more information about what has been developed, what the plans are, and increasingly, I think importantly, because 80% of the private sector on the continent is comprised of SMEs. So the African private sector doesn't always have the capacity and the resource that stakeholders in Europe or the US, Northern Hemisphere may have. So there's a need for collaboration and cooperation. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today. And I hope that you will enjoy the session. As was mentioned by Kareem, if you do have questions along the way, please feel free to put them into the Q&A part of the chat. There's chat and there's Q&A. We'd like your questions ideally to go into the Q&A box. So we're joined by Julius Kabibi, who is the program analyst for UNDRR Africa. He's also the coordinator of ARISE Africa based in Nairobi. We also have Riza Neri, who's the network coordination specialist for UNDP-OCHA's Connecting Business initiative. Glad to have her joining us from Turkey. Michelle Kahasha, who is the CEO of Delilions, is also the ARISE DRC and Central Africa coordinator. We're planting an ARISE chapter there, and Michelle is at the helm of that effort. In your programs, we had Isabel Salabart, who was the president of Axion Foundation and helped really get the private sector humanitarian platform off the ground in Madagascar. Unfortunately, she could not join us, but we're very pleased to have Vio. And Vio told me when I asked him to write his name in that I probably was going to have trouble with it. So Vio, when you present your responses, I'm going to ask you to pronounce your name. I don't want to butcher it on recorded film, but he is representing the private sector humanitarian platform from Madagascar. So good morning to all of you. I'd like to start off our conversation with a series of questions to set the scene a bit and give our audience a bit more information about what we're all working with. And so I'd like Riza to ask you, when we talk about disaster resilience, what does that really mean from a very practical standpoint? And in particular, what activities do private sector stakeholders get involved with or are invited to be involved with to address and to create greater disaster resilience?
Thanks a lot, Michael. And firstly, happy International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction, everyone. Now, the question when it comes to what does it really mean when we say or when we ask private sector engagement in disaster management is very important, because this session, you will hear a lot about private sector's role and promoting the role of the African private sector when it comes to disaster management. But what does it really mean at the practical level? And allow me to answer this by reflecting on the different engagement approaches of our Connecting Business Initiative member networks, one of which is PSHP in Madagascar, where we have Vio here. And I see the networks working in disaster management in terms of the following. But note that when we talk about disaster management from a business context, it's always about business continuation. But we've seen now how the different member networks work in disaster management in terms of three approaches. So first is the philanthropic way, whether through its corporate social responsibility programs or fundraising activities and donation drives to support response and relief efforts. And our member networks have raised, for example, around $42.2 million last year to support different activities, not just for COVID-19 response, but also for preparedness, response, and even recovery activities. The second would be in terms of operations. So this is where you see private sector expertise in, for example, business continuity, in logistics and so on, being shared and integrated with how governments and humanitarian and development agencies work. And we have CBI networks that are part, for example, of national disaster management councils and logistics clusters. And one concrete example is again, PSHP Madagascar, who is now building their own emergency or business emergency operations center that can work hand in hand with the National Emergency Operations Center of the government, or of BNGRC. And lastly, and this is my last point, that when we view private sector as part of the affected community, so meaning in the framing of livelihood safeguarding, especially in countries in the continent where, like what you said, Michael, 80 to 90% of what we call private sector are small, medium enterprises. And I always feel that this is an important framing, particularly when we talk about reducing disaster risks and losses, and whether private sector engagement will now need to double down on helping vulnerable small businesses. So those are in terms of how we've seen private sector engagement in disaster management has been reflected in the works of our member networks and also other private sector partners.
Thank you very much, Riza. Your comments lead me, Julius, to you, because we've been trying to plant ARISE Africa, not really trying, working to plant ARISE Africa. But you've been at the coalface of making those calls to motivate companies and groups to think about ARISE Africa. And so I'd like to get your insights on what are the entry points for the private sector to get involved in humanitarian response initiatives related to natural hazards and climate disasters. And also, what may be some of the barriers where you found it harder? What are some of the challenges that people have put forward in terms of why they may not embrace or engage immediately the call to become part of ARISE, or in general to get involved in these types of initiatives? Over to you.
Thank you, Michael, and good morning, participants. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. Maybe I'll start with discussing about the barriers. I have, through experience, seen that one of the most critical barriers for the private sector participating or joining the government to develop resilience is basically the non-conducive policy environment. You find in most governments there is no such clear policies on how to engage with the private sector. This is one thing that hinders free and fair playground for businesses to thrive. And unless and until when we have an honest discussion between the private sector and the government, sitting at the same table, discussing, formulating policies which are conducive, then of course this problem, this barrier will continue to stay. And this is what we are advocating, that it is time now to partner with governments and other stakeholders to come together and have a very honest dialogue on policy and legislations and laws which will enable business to thrive. The other barrier that I've seen, a very common barrier, is that still as we go on, we find the DRR capacity is still very low. It is quite limited. I've talked to quite a number of private sector. Most of them have heard about the SENDAI framework, which is a very good tool for use in propagating resilience. But very few have an inside understanding of what do we mean really by the SENDAI framework. How can we apply it with its own guiding principles, with its own priorities? Very few of these private sector entities are having the good basic knowledge that can be applied to help them to develop resilience. The other barrier that I see is basically in resourcing. As Michael, you rightly said, that most of the private sector or most of the economic activities are with the SMEs. You said 80%, which I really agree. It is mostly the SMEs, and those SMEs, of course, run into a lot of problems. When disasters occur, their businesses are destroyed, and we find that most of them, and they never bounce back. They just disappear. So there is no financing mechanism that is put forward that when this happens, when a disaster comes and affects their businesses, then they can bounce back, and perhaps now they have the resilience to bounce back and continue with their businesses. Most of them, they just go away. Another serious problem that I've seen also that affects some of the businesses in the private sector is it's touching on my first barrier on policy direction, but it's basically on dumping. In Africa, we have a problem of dumping. We have goods and services that are coming from cheap areas which are dumped, and therefore the local manufacturers, the local businesses cannot thrive because the ground is uneven. So they have an uneven playing ground, and therefore nothing they cannot survive. They are wiped out by those kind of dumping and so on. Coming to what you asked me about, what we think about focusing on ARISE in Africa in years to come, I think I see a huge potential, and I'm glad to say that we have a good task force that is working on this. There is a good potential for engagement with the private sector in Africa, and the private sector and national government has been working in silos, as I said before. But we are working towards changing this. We are working towards bringing these two entities together so that at least we have a narrative which will support each other and help each other to grow. Africa, as has been said, is one of the wealthiest continent, but of course, despite being the wealthiest, this world has not been exploited. It doesn't help Africa. It's one of the most youthful continent with a lot of much of the population below the age of 35. And therefore, we need, the private sector needs to tap on this kind of resources that Africa is having. The labor force will come from this youth dividends, and therefore there's that potential in minerals, there's potential in all sorts of material that we need to thrive as a business entity. If we have a good socio-political environment, then businesses definitely in Africa are going to thrive. To give you an example, before COVID came, I think Ghana, some countries in Ghana, like Ghana, Rwanda, Tanzania, Ethiopia, they had the highest GDP in the world. And this is a demonstration that we are ready to take off. What we are doing currently now in Africa is to try to see how we have strategic planning for the ARISE Africa network, whereby we'll bring in the issue of capacity building. We'll have issues of financing opportunities. How do we come up with proper financing strategy? And I believe once this is done in Africa, it's going to be a win-win situation. Over to you, Michael.
Oh, thank you very much, Julius. I mean, the good thing is that we have Michelle and Vio here who are themselves in the private sector. And so we can also hear from them in terms of their experiences and their efforts and conversations with colleagues in the private sector about the appetite, if you will, the reservations, if those exist as well. Vio, I'd like to ask you, because the private sector humanitarian platform in Madagascar arguably is really a shining light within not just the Africa for CBI, but in all of the 11 networks. I'd like to ask how your team has gone about trying to engage the private sector and what's been the rallying call, because there's always this thought with a smaller enterprise and even some bigger enterprises, just by staying in business, employing people, I am making a contribution. Tell us a little bit about how PSHP has engaged with the Malagasy private sector.
Thank you very much, Michael, for the question. My name is Viu Razafi Njakut. I'm in charge of the coordination of the program and also the partnership of the private sector humanitarian platform here in Madagascar. So I will try to explain you with a simple words how the private sector here in Madagascar are involved in helping or supporting the Madagascar governments and humanitarian actors in disaster risk management. So first of all, we can know that disasters didn't impact only the affected communities, but also businesses. These are main stakes which are often exposed to several disasters. Global crisis due to COVID-19, for example, is one of the proof which paralyze all country economic activities. So if we talk about challenges for now and a long time ago, private sector has been parts of entities which help through punctual or one-shot activities during disaster periods by providing, for example, food or INFIs to victims. But now we know about the potentiality of private sector to go beyond these emergency activities. If they could invest in disaster risk management, private sector is now being considered as new actors involved in humanitarian reliefs, in partnerships, obviously with traditional humanitarian actors and governments. They could help in preparedness and emergency responses by providing, for example, their expertise and equipment in affected area. Like if we can take the telecommunication companies here in Madagascar, they can provide equipments through the new technology of information and communication tools to improve all data and information analysis about hazards, about disaster and loss assessments. How about these activities or equipment are required in order to save lives and mitigate great damage and losses before, during, and after disasters. Multiple challenges can be observed. For now, humanitarian is not the initial core businesses of private sector, but disaster could affect its activities at any moment, and especially the SMEs or the main victims of disasters here in Madagascar. So having an effective coordination between governments and humanitarian actors and private sector in a great debate about disaster risk management, and also having elements of persuasion to all companies in Madagascar to be parts of this disaster risk management activities through their corporate social responsibility or creating shared value, for example. We need to be very persistent in a lifetime if we want to convince that private sector and humanitarian actors should work in complementarity here in Madagascar and also in all African countries now. So my vision is very simple. In order to realize efficiently the African private sector reorientation in humanitarian scale, we have to be aligned with the SENDAI framework, as we talked earlier, and its priority in investing on disaster risk reduction, and also with the national disaster risk management policies or strategies, like the case of Madagascar, that the private sector here is part of this sort of mechanism. The PSHP works too in complementarity with Malagasy government to reduce progressively the impact of disasters. Madagascar is one of the most exposed countries to disaster and the effect of climate change too. So Madagascar private sector must make partnership with, if we want to reach goals of the SENDAI frameworks, and the PSHP, through its member, ensure the continuity of essential activities during crisis time by setting up several tools. They stand to the business protection. We can quote about the business continuity plan, for example, or the PSHP contingency plan, which prepared the readiness of the private sector if any disasters will occur. And at last, The PPP is reflected through private sector involvement in activities, projects derived to disaster risk management cycle, like the preparation, emergency responses, and recovery. We don't want to stop to mobilize the PSHP members and other companies to make partnership with government and also humanitarian actors to a common reason, the disaster risk management linked to the economical development. Thank you very much.
Ovio, thank you very much for that. I think that provides to all of our listeners a good sense of one, the reason, the fact that the country has identified the fact that it has risks and it has to prepare. And those risks don't just impact affected communities, they impact the business community as well. And your understanding, and I think it follows up on Julius's point, that the SENDAI framework does give one a grounding, but the private sector has to understand it as well. And so obviously there's a need for all of us in this space to promote the SENDAI framework and make sure that the private sector on the continent is well aware of all its tenets. Michelle, I want to shift over to you because the effort to plant an ARISE network in DRC is a younger one, but at the same time, one can easily see that it's quite critical with the volcano that erupted earlier this year and severely impacted the eastern city of Goma. You've engaged, and I'll just put this out there because I'm aware of it, with institutions like Global Compact, who are also in DRC. How have you approached colleagues about the mission of ARISE and what's been their responses, and how do you see, if you were giving Julius your counsel, one can prepare to make sure that we get the attention and capture the imagination of the private sector?
Thanks, Michael, for the opportunity to share with other colleagues the experience that we've seen in Goma and the good learnings that we took out of this sad experience with the volcano. First of all, as you said, if it comes to understanding what can be private sector response and helping managing this type of crisis, I think we should first of all break it in two. One is the traditional private sector, as we know, with multinational companies and so on, and also taking a step look at SMEs in a particular way. Now, when it comes to the traditional private sector, let's break it into 3 steps: before the disaster, during, and after. What can the private sector do? What we've seen in Goma is, for instance, when it comes to building awareness or putting in place awareness campaigns, that's where we see a lot of place for private sector to play. Let's just assume all the FMCG companies that we have, all the breweries, all the telecoms, for instance, or even banks. Just after the volcano, they started putting huge billboard in the city, telling people what are the top 3 right behaviors to have in case the volcano erupts again. So these are the kind of things where you know that, for instance, get out of your home, put yourself in a safer place, don't try to carry things with you. These are the simple behaviors, but where the private sector forget about competition, and it's really about collaboration and working together in order to manage and end the crisis. So in terms of education campaign awareness, that's where I think private sector can definitely play a big role. Then when it comes to managing the crisis itself, we've seen a lot of discussion coming with, especially with the banking sector and the telecoms, where people understood that there's a need to maintain a minimum of economic activity, which requires somehow cash handling. And in a crisis mode where you have the volcano, definitely you cannot access to your ATM. banks cannot open. So you definitely need another corridor of making money circulate. And that's where tools like mobile money, like in Kenya, people know M-Pesa and so on. All these created a network, created a new way of approaching cash handling. And that's where you can see clearly that the private sector or the banking sector itself has a good role to play in just maintaining the entire economic activity in place. And then if you have to think about after the disaster itself, where you start thinking about how do you mitigate or do you help those who have suffered from the volcano, you see the role of insurance. And we are engaging a lot with two major insurance companies in the country to see how we can even think forward and have more of disaster adapted products. There's also this aspect of reconstruction, where even in terms of infrastructure, you see how government itself cannot rebuild everything. Government cannot rebuild all roads. And that's where some giants in the private sector have to come in and help rebuilding those infrastructure. So that's what I'm seeing about the traditional private sector. But when it comes to SMEs in particular, the challenges become bigger because of the size, because of lack of business continuity tools that you have in major corporations, that those SMEs we do not have. I chair a network of SMEs supported by World Bank through a dedicated program that's put together training, capacity building, and also a little bit of subsidies. I can tell you, Michael, just having, let's just consider premises where those SMEs are operating. You have a volcanic eruption, those premises are destroyed. SMEs are not like banks where you have multiple branches where you can still operate. So just having an earthquake after the catastrophe means that literally these SMEs had to close. Or the challenges when it comes to building or putting in place premises that are seismic compliant, it creates a burden for SMEs. When it comes to just facing your financial commitments after volcanic eruption, I can tell you, Michael, I've seen a lot of SMEs suffering from the fact that, yes, I had a credit before, I had a payment plan, but now everything is closed. How do I repay? How do I restart? Then you start getting into conversations with banks, with MFIs, where you start talking about delaying payments and so on. So you can see how, when it comes to SME, the impact of disaster is multiplied 5, 10 times more than the other players of private sector. So we have to factor all that and start thinking forward. We have directly engaged with those insurance companies, as I mentioned to you before, in order to help us with micro insurance products. Let's assume that to cover a risk on my building, let's assume we're talking about, let's say, $1,000 a year. But when it comes to SME, the payout, the out of pocket, the pressure on cash is not the same as for a larger corporation paying $1,000 at once. So we are discussing with those insurance saying, for instance, where you were charging $1,000, can you bring it to $100 a month, for instance? I'm just giving you the kind of scale we discuss it. So it becomes a micro insurance, even if it costs more, it costs 20% more at the end of the year. But in terms of monthly charges for an SME, it's easier to generate $100 to be covered for a risk rather than being exposed throughout the year until it is able to collect $1,000. So these are the kind of mechanisms we're talking about now. It will take us another quarter or two to develop, but we will get there. When it comes to, I've mentioned to you the premises. we're discussing with some landowners to see, like in Goma, how can we start building, let's say, SMEs hub, where we can have a proper construction, where you can put together 20, 50, or maybe more SMEs in a safe environment with a rent that is affordable, but yet they are covered. So these are the kind of mechanism we're talking about now, where we want to protect SMEs, but at the same time put them, build that awareness around disaster and making sure that everybody understands it's our duty, it's our survival, which is there, right? So sorry, I hope I haven't been too long and went beyond the time that was allocated. So thanks, and I'm open for questions and discussions.
No, thank you, Michelle. I mean, one of the things that you mentioned, and the literature backs this up, is that when there is a crisis, it really helps focus the mind of the private sector. And so this recent, initiative, well, all the innovations and initiatives that you've mentioned around the eastern part of the country in Goma after the volcano has people thinking, okay, what do we do to make sure that next time, we're prepared? How do we build resilient infrastructure, clustered infrastructure? So, I mean, I think that's helpful to add to this conversation. Vio mentioned that in Madagascar, because again, you've got these climatic events that are happening with greater frequency. There's you move to prevention. You don't want to wait till the aftermath, because you know that it's a very difficult thing to adjust to. I want to come back to Julius and Riza, because the thing is right now, as I understand it, there are 4 CBI networks in Africa. There's Madagascar, there's Kenya, there's Cote d'Ivoire. Who am I forgetting? Riza, you'll
have
help
3.
me.
There you go. You have 3.
I want to have the 4th. And then Julius, it's just South Africa, it's Kenya, it's DRC coming, and some conversations in West Africa. We've got 55 countries on the whole continent and 45 in sub-Saharan Africa, many of which are facing these crises. What are the next steps? And Riza, I'll start with you in terms of how do you narrow down? Obviously, the purse strings are not unlimited, and so resource has to be focused. Where do you see going? And then what makes a good potential CBI host? I mean, what are you looking for in the country and in the organizations that would host? And then Julius, I would ask you the same. When ARISE thinks about moving forward and adding networks, what's driving those decisions? Riza, over to you.
Sure. Now, the colleagues have already discussed, and you've already shared how the continent is exposed to a wide range of hazards. So understanding what are our worst case scenarios in the continent is also one way to keep on, engaging the private sector. And in terms of the entry points, in understanding how would we be able to engage the actors? I see it in terms of 4 work streams or 4 avenues. So number 1, it will be promoting risk information, a wider range of participation in understanding disaster risks. So in risk assessment. So, and I know that someone in the chat, in the Q&A has been asking, how can the private sector be engaged? So letting private sector be part of that discussion on risk information and understanding disaster risks and hazards in the continent. Governance is one. And I wanted to ask Julius as well, when it comes to the stock taking exercise that we're doing, when it comes to how many of the countries in the continent already have their national DRR action plans and strategies, and whether these action plans have concrete, explicit mention of private sector. Because I'd always want to see whether there's an explicit mention of private sector in those national DRR action plans and strategy. Inclusion of the private sector in national and regional, subnational, national, and regional DRR mechanisms. The third would be in terms of financial resources. So risk transfer mechanisms, risk-informed planning and development. And I see that there's a participant from the African risk capacity. So really revisiting regional disaster risk pooling, regional and national risk pooling, disaster risk pooling mechanisms, and how the private sector can engage. And last would be technical and institutional capacities. How can national governments, humanitarian and development partners can work with private sector? And in terms of CBI, the beauty of CBIs is really working through networks. So I hear from the discussion today that there would be ways of looking at private sector, the national large corporations, and at the same time the SMEs. So one way of engaging the the SMEs would be through networks or platforms. So as we do the scoping assessment in the region, we hope that through those avenues and activities, more networks would be able to say that I'd want to be in this kind of discussion, whether through CBI or ARISE.
Excellent. And you may find some are part of both, interestingly. Julius, what are your thoughts
Thank
about this?
Thank you so much, Michael, and thank you, Lisa, for pointing out some very important points on how we need to move forward. I want to reiterate that in Africa, the ARISE movement is quite new. It's in its formative stage. We started in early 2020. And as you know, soon after that, we had the challenges of COVID. And I would confess here, we have never had even a single face-to-face meeting. We have just always been discussing virtually, connecting virtually, and I feel very encouraged that we have kept the fire burning despite those challenges. So we have a very strong task team that has been helping us to see how we can move forward and establish a strong ARISE African network. And to do this, we came up with a kind of an agreed structure for this. The structure is such that we have regional ARISE networks. I know Michael already alluded to one, like, for example, the one that Michelle is leading for Central and Western Africa. So we have already some nodes. One of the well-established ARISE, as we talk now, is the ARISE South Africa, which Michael is heading. We have another ARISE for Eastern Africa, taking care of EAC and the SANDAC region, which is being headed by Jude Wambugu and also another colleague called Kenneth Macharia. We have an ARISE network that is to be established for the Western Africa Chamber of Commerce and Industries. They are in the process of changing a bit of their legislation so that they can be admitted into the ARISE network. So we're in the formative stage. We have already the structure, and this structure is chosen in such that we have regional nodes or regional networks, and from these regional networks, then we move down to national networks, and this way now the question that Lisa was talking about could be answered when we come to that. So we are at this stage, we are still doing what we call serious advocacy work and trying to see how we can recruit as many people as possible to come to to join us, and there so that we can have the critical mass and be able to move this process forward. We have already established a website because the ARISE Africa, of course, was arranged to what we have, the ARISE Global Network, which is run by the UNDRR at the headquarters. So everything we arranged ourselves to the global network in terms of looking at what's the value proposition for the ARISE, looking at what are the objectives, what do we need to do, what is it that we want to achieve. So all those things we have arranged ourselves to the global network. So when we come now to when we are fully established, when we implement what I had discussed earlier about the strategies that we're trying to think we need to move quickly and develop, and when we have critical mass on board, then definitely we'll be able to launch our ARISE African network with all those other branches. For ISA, the number of countries with which include the private sector in the action plan is a difficult question for me but I can tell you for sure that many of the countries do not integrate the private sector, and that's why we are there as ARISE. That's why we need to combine ourselves to come together with CBI so that we can engage also with governments and really bring the issue of private sector together. We carry out what we call the SENDAI framework monitor, and we have seen quite a number of countries do report on this. We have like 33 countries that report, but when you scan through, I don't think there's a lot of issues to do with the private sector that are reflected there. So this is a thing that we need to put our eyes forward as we move on. Over to you, Michael.
No, thank you very much for that. And I think that monitor, to add a metric related to the private sector engagement, would be useful in years to come. I want to, recognizing that we're down to the short strokes in terms of the time left for our panel, time flies when you're having fun, turn to a question that's in the chat, because it actually speaks to some of the comments that were made. Charles Tonis writes, I'm a disaster risk policy analyst at the Nairobi City Risk Hub. What is clear is the lack of integration of private sector at the DRR committee and research level. I have had conversation with the Kenya Private Sector Alliance, KEPSA, to initiate integration of private sector players. How can we expedite this in the face of, say, a project-based approach? Riza, I'm going to ask you, because you're representing CBI and the networks developed around associations like KEPSA. And then Julius, I want to ask you, because I know in the past you've had engagement with KEPSA. How do we respond? Because Charles is saying flat out, right now, the private sector is outside of the humanitarian network. And that's just one country, but Kenya is a very influential country in East Africa.
Absolutely. And I just wanted to also acknowledge what Charles pointed out, that even at the research level, I mean, I did a quick search in one academic repository hub on doing DRR work on private sector, nothing showed up. In Africa, right? African case studies, nothing showed up. So how do we move this forward? So I've been talking about making very explicit mention of private sector representation in national disaster risk reduction action plan and strategies. And I mean, what better way to do that than this year with the theme of IDDR is international cooperation and partnerships. But I would also want to say that starting very, very small, concrete activities, 1 or 2 activities that you'd want to focus on. And I wanted to bring in Vio to say that, to give a specific example on which kind of activity did PSHP focus on in its earlier years. Because having that kind of focus on just 1 or 2 activities to start the initiative and have more partners coming together, rallying behind the private sector engagement is actually quite effective before it blossoms into a full-blown program. But maybe before we go to Julius, I want to bring in Bio to say that what were the initial activities of PSHP Madagascar when they were starting out?
Bio, over to you.
Much, Riza. Yes. Okay. For the first time when we had created on 2014 with the initiative of the United Nations, who discussing with some companies here in Madagascar. So we having some discussion about how the private sector can be part of the humanitarian actors which can contributing or supporting the government in DRM activities. So we began with very small activities focusing our supplies, our expertise about the emergency response. If there are cyclone or floods which can occur in Madagascar. So step by step, we are taking lead to be the representative of the private sector here in Madagascar. If there are meetings, events, or some webinars between all traditional humanitarian actors and also the government. So the private sector has gained some key place for the intervenant of disaster risk management of Madagascar, thanks to the UNOCHA and also our National Bureau of Disaster Risk Management, who supports in every time the private sector engagement. So at the moment, if there are meetings, if there are events which appear here in Madagascar, the PSHP is always automatically be invited by the NGOs, by the government, and by the United Nations to be part of the discussion. And we can, on this scale, supports and by sharing our experiences, sharing our skills about how the private sector can be part of this kind of humanitarian scales. And we had a very great transformation and reorientation about our vision in humanitarian fields. And that's why the PSHP with this business emergency operations center will be setting by this year, and we want to have many stakeholders about this project as the NGO, as the government, and also all the United Nations like UNICEF or World Food Program to be part of our projects.
Thank you. Julius, I'm just going to take a bit of prerogative, just given the time. I'm going to say to Charles, we will reach out to you because we want this to be an action item, period, to follow up with you and to likely follow up with KEPSA as well. I wanted to close our session because we still have one more presentation to be made. I want to thank everyone on the panel for all of your insights. I think that this is kind of a roadshow that we should replicate. It was one of the themes that we thought we would do. I think we definitely need to do more of these. But I want to bring in, for closing remarks, Hans-Peter Tofers. And Hans has really a unique perspective on all of this, representing UPS Foundation. He also is the co-chair of ARISE, and UPS Foundation is one of the partner supporters of CBI. And so if you could talk to us a little bit about how UPS Foundation has seen its role as a supporter of humanitarian work in terms of DRM and DRR, and then also about your thoughts on public-private partnership. And obviously, this is a conversation that will have to continue. So over to you, Hans Peter.
Michael, thanks a lot. Yes, indeed. I mean, we have by far not enough time to discuss that aspect, even though it is very interesting, as I'm trying to work on this topic since quite a while. Now, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Many thanks for inviting me to close your commemoration event on the International Day for DNR. And just to remind us all, it is not only growing collaboration in the private sector, it is about cross-border collaboration on target F to complement national action through development activities from partners that are potentially stronger. That's my interpretation in that regard. So let me lead you through a couple of thoughts. Now, I'm the freshly appointed co-chair of the Global ARISE board. And being freshly appointed sometimes helps to add perspectives to goals and achievements, and I hope therefore that I can support the great work you are doing here to build private sector DRI engagement. What are we doing? You mentioned the different roles that we are having. Now, I'm with the UPS Foundation, where we have a long-standing relationship to work on disasters. We are helping with in-kind efforts, supporting UN agencies and other organizations in capacity building efforts. And we have supported UNDRR since the old days when the agency was called UNISDR, because we believed in the concept of knowledge sharing. And since years, we support the development of Prevention Web with almost all of the toolkits and resources to build resilience in communities and achieve the SENDAI targets. In parallel, we worked with UNDP and OCHA together, founding CBI at the Istanbul World Humanitarian Summit in 2016. We knew that creating networks, especially in low and middle income countries, with private sector participants is challenging development work, and resources are needed in absence of state funding supporting this process in many ways. In the past years, we have focused on developing countries, trying to support network building processes. The motto is help to help yourself. And we started focusing on SMB resilience, small and medium-sized businesses, offering business continuity training because UPS is operating in almost every country in the world, and SMBs are typically our customer backbone, as it is for all the societies around the globe. You mentioned Africa, where SMBs are standing for local community profiles, for jobs, for local income. And if you look into the statistics, it's everywhere, up to 99% of the companies are SMBs. However, we started questioning this form of engagement when asking whether our impact makes the difference, taking into account that probably 2,000 trained SMEs in a country with 2 million of them does not lead to a significant level of resilience. So we partnered up with a small group of companies trying to incorporate a benefit-driven model of partnership with SMBs using Turkey as a model. If you like, visit saglamkobi.org if you want to know more about that, as time is unfortunately limited today. We worked with a concept that is called resilience in a box. This is how the generic model is called. 6 languages, different countries, replicable format, and this is our commitment across borders as well. You can find links at CBI as well as on the ARISE website. Scaling in partnership helped us out of a loop situation where we were perpetuating complicated engagement models. The UPS Foundation is still engaged in both networks with, let's say, one main component that is related to SMBs, and we work on local projects as well as on board level, on the CBI side, as well as through my role in ARISE. For us, DRR has become a business decision, equally important to ESG reporting that we have introduced this year. Most relevant is to get away from the island and seek for collaboration. The need for international collaboration increases the bigger global challenges are getting. And they are truly global. Just think about a 400-meter vessel blocking the Suez Canal. Did block the world trade this year, and not, I don't want to even mention COVID and the complexity of being prepared for broad vaccination processes within volatile public health systems and the impact of global value chains that we will have. We need to think truly globally in this regard. This is what we learned in the past years. And what I learned today from your perspectives is a lot as well. So that would be, I would need enough time for even making my comments to all the presentations. So let me focus on just a few of them. So first of all, what I saw out of your comments is very simple. Africa is a case on its own due to population growth, to urbanization, and of course, other factors. But as the networks are fresh, it offers as well opportunities to make it better, to do it better and differently. Second thing is, there are so many challenges. So therefore, we have to focus. And so, trying to build use cases that are convincing as a value proposition, as Risa proposed, is probably good. At the end of the day, a deeper collaboration with governments is necessary to build real DRR and cross-border collaboration, because cross-border collaboration is between governments. 5 of the 8 indicators for target F are related to development projects that are discussed between governments. So as long as development aid is given by a stronger partner, then DRR can be used as a precondition in order to give them money and the support if we advise in the right manner. So that is a lever as well. Please think about it. Institutionalization is very relevant. That is one thing that has been mentioned in the discussion, and I can only echo that. You need to be taken seriously. Otherwise, you need to have a certain type of heaviness as a network, whatever type of network it is. Otherwise, you will be unheard. And last but not least, so lots of expressions we use in parallel. So we have disaster management, disaster risk management, several aspects of preparedness and other phases of the disaster cycle. We probably need more clarity on that for a coordinated business approach towards disaster risk reduction. That is what it is about, with efficient governance, cooperation with government and the UNs, and collaboration amongst more partners. Now, I'm really excited about this webinar today because it was one of my let's say very ambitious goals to reduce redundancies in collaboration within the private sector. There's always a time for competition, but there is another time as well for collaboration, and it's probably high time for collaborating better, especially when resources are getting down due to the fact that we have an economic downswing everywhere, and the readiness of governments to pay is getting down. And the private sector will not be able to replace that funding resource. So therefore, we have to make it better rather than trying to get more. That is my message and my takeaway for today. Thanks a lot for listening and for your patience. And I hope we will be able to talk soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hans-Peter. And as we wrap up, I want to start with comments that were made in our concept note and shared, and just underscore that for the teams at CBI and ARISE Africa, this is not meant to be a once-off. There are some things that we would like to do to come out of this and to continue the collaboration, Hans-Peter, that you spoke of. So one of those things is we'd like to publish a business brief on business networks and their role in disaster risk management, so jointly developed. We also plan to hold a joint session at the upcoming Africa Regional Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction, November 16th through 19th. That will be, I think, hybrid, but it will be most likely a virtual engagement. And then also, we want to co-host a series of awareness campaigns / virtual roadshows in advance of the global platform for disaster risk reduction, which Irina mentioned, which is taking place in May of next year. And we'll also try and do that with interpretation embedded or in French, just because so many countries on the continent are Francophone. So we appreciate Michelle and Vieux in engaging with us in English, but we want to make sure that colleagues of yours in your countries who may not be bilingual are also able to tune in. I want to say thanks to all who helped make this session possible again. We're very pleased with this. The recording, I think, will be shared so that colleagues who didn't join us will be able to reflect upon the insights shared. And please just stay tuned and watch this space, because there'll be more initiatives coming to you where we're collaborating. Thanks very much, everyone, and have a great morning and great celebratory day. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot, Michael.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you so much, Michael. Bye. Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Everyone.
All right. Bye-bye.